Hey everyone, welcome to Critical Faculty. This is the third part of the God of the Gap series, and today I have a guest speaker who I've had a word with before. I've enjoyed the conversation previously, and today we are going to tackle the next problem that is logically follows from the God of the Gaps, the cosmological gap, and the gap of the biogenesis or the emergence of life. And we are going to talk about consciousness. Hello, Richard.
Hello.
Great
Nice
to have you
be here
again.
Yeah, it's nice to be here again.
Fantastic. Well, we've had a conversation before, and since then I've gained multiple viewers. So if you could please just introduce yourself and explain why you're relevant in this conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm a known quantity in the atheism movement out in the United States, and worldwide. People read my stuff all over the world. But the most relevant is my first book was Sense and Goodness Without God, and it was a defense of metaphysical naturalism, and it was the first and still the only complete positive worldview for atheism. Like, if you're an atheist, what should you believe in? Not just what shouldn't you believe in. And it covers all the categories: epistemology, aesthetics, theory of art and beauty, and ethics, ontology, semantics, like all of those things. And of course, I have a whole section on the mind. Like, well, given the scientific facts that we have, what should we infer? And I did a ton of research for this, so it's well researched, has good bibliography. And ever since then, I've published in philosophy under peer review and done other things, quite a lot of work in philosophy. So I'm actually more informed on that subject and many other philosophical subjects now than I was then. But people who want to look into this, my website, richardcarrier.info, has everything about me: my social media, Twitter, Facebook, my blog. If you want to take my online courses, I teach an online course on free will, where we get into the subject of consciousness and what it is and so on. So that's basically my main qualifications for being here. My PhD is in intellectual history of religion and philosophy in the ancient world. But through my whole life, I've had a second track of publishing in philosophy quite a lot.
That's brilliant. Obviously, the conversation today follows from the first two parts. So just to give you a little bit of a background, Richard, and to the viewers as well, the situation started a few months ago. An application started that's taken the world by storm called Clubhouse. And Clubhouse is an open source sort of an application, very akin to the Paltalk of the old days, where you can open rooms, chat rooms, and you can introduce a subject and people are listening. But it's highly encrypted, so your privacy is well protected, and it's attracted a lot from the Middle East. And I was astonished by the amount of ex-Muslims, and I'm an ex-Muslim myself. I have an Egyptian heritage, so all these Arabic speakers who are confessing to have left their faiths, it was incredible to see the amount of people talking about that. But obviously, the counter movement came from the faithful. Came in herds trying to defend their faith by obviously opening opposing rooms, and the one subject that kept coming, because obviously they no longer can do the classical look at how the camels were created, look how wonderful they are now talking about science. They're a lot more sophisticated than before.
Yeah, they're catching up. I often pointed this out, that Christian apologists have been getting hammered for like 100 years in the West, and so they've had to refine their game, as it were. And so I've noticed like 20 years ago, Islamic apologetics looked a lot like 1920s Christian apologetics. It was very naive, very easy to refute, kind of silly. And yeah, it's getting more sophisticated now that they have to face actual criticism and they have to come up with better ideas. And so where do you end up? You end up in the same place the Christians did, which is God of the Gaps arguments.
Exactly. And so the God of the Gaps is just basically using a current, because that doesn't have to stay for long. It's a current gap in knowledge that is easily confessed by science, because science never shies away from saying the wonderful 2 words of or 3 words of "I don't know." which is, I don't know why the human species have sort of allergic to these three words, and basically say, well, we don't know, but we are trying to find out. But then the faithful will come say, aha, and here lies my God, my version of a God out of the multiple versions you've got there. But for some reason, when you speak to a theist, they completely get away from the Jesus and the Allah, and suddenly they reduce their belief to a deistic, almost a God of Spinoza God, just to make it a bit more scientific.
Right, yeah.
What do you think of that?
Yeah, and that happens right alongside, like, the same people will then turn around and then like defend worldly miracles and demons and angels and exorcism and stuff like that. So it's like they know all of their actual beliefs are very indefensible and unpopular, but they think that they can use this as a wedge to get in, right? Like maybe we can get an atheist to at least believe this thing, and then somehow we can then stepwise move them all the way to the like crazy superstitious stuff that we actually believe. That's what I see working. There's not really any such thing as an evangelical deist. Really, right? There's no like organization of deists out there who are like, no, we reject all the supernatural stuff. We're just here to invent some sort of indifferent clockwork God, and we're going to just go invade chat rooms to try and prove it. Like it's not a thing. So so the God of the Gaps argument is a wedge argument. It's an attempt to get in with something that looks more respectable, or as respectable as they can make it look, in the hopes that they can like pull people further into the much more elaborate religion that they're actually defending.
Yeah. So with the previous couple of conversations before, we sort of reaching the point where, and somebody's actually made a reference here, presuppositions and how horrible
they can be. Yeah, the worst is presup is the comment.
It's absolutely correct, because it's exactly the stance that science takes. You know, science doesn't matter, even if the idea is something that it does not appeal to you, or something that you don't wish it to be true, but you follow the steps, and the steps will take you to the right evidence. But when you have a belief already made, and you're trying to manufacture evidence to prove that particular presupposition you got, how dangerous is that?
Yeah, it's rationalization rather than testing, right? And it's dangerous in the sense that methodology is guaranteed to trap you in a delusion, a system of beliefs, many of which will be false, which will subject you easily to manipulation by outside powers. I think this is one of probably the biggest threats of religion, is that it makes you easily vulnerable to manipulation and control by other people. Whereas because it doesn't come with a critical mindset. If it came with a critical mindset, it would be self-destructive. And this is actually a point that's been made with certain evangelical trends in the United States, where there's in the mid 20th century, there was a huge push for truth. Truth is of extremely important value. Truth matters, evidence matters, and things like that. And so apologetics sort of organized around that. But the problem is that you lose. As soon as you make it about truth and evidence, that's not sustainable for a false belief. So you get a lot of ex-evangelicals that actually were led out of their religion and are now atheists, secularists, some deists, agnostics, and so on, because of their own religion instilling this value for truth. That actually that value became self-destructive of their religion, and they were actually able to get out and realize that, well, if you pursue the truth, you end up somewhere else than these guys were. So that's I think a key thing. And if you abandon that value for truth, or if you only give it lip service and you don't take it seriously, then that's going to affect every other aspect of your life. You're going to make a lot of bad decisions. You're going to form a lot of bad beliefs because you don't have a critical faculty in order to plug your show's title, which is totally correct, right? We all need much more critical faculties to resist misinformation and false beliefs.
That's very true. And I'm going to refer to something that happens within the atheistic communities as well. We're not immune.
Oh, yeah. No one is, right? This is a human thing. We might get into that later about how our brains are really badly designed.
Yeah. But, you know, the conversation, for example, when Lawrence Krauss came up with a universe from nothing, and all what he was trying to show, that there is a possibility, it's a plausible possibility that because of rules of quantum mechanics, then a universe can actually come out of nothing. And by nothing, it's not the physical, it's not the philosophical nothing, it's the physical nothing, which is something.
Which is what everybody nailed him on. Is
correct. And you yourself, Richard, your position as, and people have often mistook you for what you were trying to achieve. And I think I've got you there, which is basically the historicity of Jesus. And all what you're trying to say is, okay, we've heard some stories. Let's go and verify whether they might have happened, they might have not, but can we have a closer look?
Right. Yeah.
But then people jumped on that saying, oh, no, you can't say that, it's
right.
You can't probe that.
I think so. Krauss would have benefited from better framing. I think if he'd known if he'd studied more what the Christian, let's call it rhetoric is, then you would know how to frame your response to it in a way that diffuses those kinds of rationalizations to reject is what he's saying. Because, really, if you analyze it in the correct framing, what he's arguing is that you can explain everything with a starting point that is way simpler than a God. So Occam's razor gets you his result, right? Which means even if his explanation is false, that means that God is even more likely to be false, right? Because it's even less probable than the simple explanation that he came up with. So he wasn't really starting with nothing. And that's what everybody kept harping on and focusing on. And that wasn't really his point. I think they talked past each other a lot. It's I'm not talking about the absolute nothing. I'm talking about you can start with something just as you do. You guys start with a God, right? We're all starting with something. And so if you frame it that way, it's well, let's talk about what is the simplest something. And what is the simplest something for which we actually have evidence? That's the other thing, is that we don't have evidence for this God, this complex, bizarre God thing. But the quantum mechanical principles that he presents are extremely well established empirically. So we know quantum mechanical phenomena can occur. And so what he describes as the sort of possible hypothesis for the formation of the universe is based on known science. So unlike the God hypothesis, which is not. So it has both the advantage of empirical support and the advantage of being vastly simpler a thesis. And so that really is the strength of his book. But if I keep talking about it as being nothing, Christians couldn't get past that. They kept focusing on, but it's not really nothing. And it's and then so the argument stops there, and they never get to his actual argument. And that's the thing that I found was most problematic about his presentation. It was only about framing. It wasn't really about the content of what he was trying to argue.
Yes, yeah, it was completely misunderstood. And when you think about the word nothing, I actually personally think that's it's never existed, because as soon as you talk about nothing, it becomes something. So
I've run into this argument too. Is so I have an analysis. I have a blog article called "The Problem with Nothing." At some point, I'm going to develop this into a peer-reviewed article. I just haven't had time. I don't get paid for peer-reviewed articles, so it's always a low work priority. But but I want to develop it because the way I've developed it so far is pretty ironclad. Is that if you actually say there's nothing, are you going to take this seriously? Absolutely nothing. Then that means there are no rules governing what will happen, because a rule would then be something, or would require something to enforce the rule, which means the idea that only nothing can come from nothing, well, that's out the window. That's no longer true, because if there's nothing, then that rule doesn't exist either, right? So that there's nothing. What follows if there is actually nothing? If you take that seriously, and I actually show through an analysis that an infinite multiverse is the inevitable outcome of an absolute state of nothing. Which really hoses the whole God argument. But I also point out in there that we don't actually know there ever was a state of nothing, right? That's a presumption. There are attempts to argue it, but they don't hold up logically. We don't know. It could be a past eternality. It could always have been something, just as Christians think there has always been a God. So they also think there's always been something. So there could always have just been a universe or a multiverse or something like that. Yeah. So there's a lot of angles on that fall apart when you really start picking at it. And we'll see that when we get to the consciousness thing too.
The conversation about nothing reminds me of that apathist who's self-declared apathist, who's saying, I don't really care. But somehow he's always involved in different conversations.
Really, he cares enough.
To me, that person, if he truly existed, you'd never see him. He would not be in the scene. He'd be doing something else.
He'd be out fishing or something. He wouldn't be on the internet talking about this stuff. But that's absolutely true.
So this is a nice segue now to that third problem, if it's a problem at all.
Right.
There is a Patricia Churchland is a neurophilosopher, and I love her description of morality and the sources of morality. She's talked about
She's
how
one of the foremost philosophers of mind nowadays.
I love listening to her,
Yeah.
and I love the connection between science and philosophy, because philosophy was detached for quite some time, and I think it's about time to start working with science. I think Daniel Dennett is doing the same thing.
Right. Yeah. The two fields tend to ignore each other more than they ought.
I think they ought to speak with each other, because once they speak with each other, magical stuff happens. And the way she explained morality and how it is a response for the search for food, at some point going from cold-blooded animals to warm-blooded animals, and the oxytocin between mammals, mother and offspring, have given rise to the first time ever your nervous system is looking after something other than yourself. And then this is how morality
prosociality as a survival strategy, which led to also the development of a sense of self, which relates to today. Why do we have a consciousness? Why do we have a self model at all? Why are we conscious? Why aren't we just apes running around banging rocks, right? Is in order to have a social system, you have to have individuals who can model other minds and thus understand intent, understand a social system. And to do that, you have to understand your place in the social system, which requires a consciousness. Now, you can have social animals that don't have consciousness, ants, for example, but they really just operate as a single organism. And in fact, you can think of the cells in your body are doing the same thing ants are doing, right? It's a colony of cells that are working together mindlessly to achieve a common purpose. But that's different than the prosociality strategy, which actually involves culture and social cooperation and requires individual thought and action. So you need a self model to situate yourself in a social system to work together to achieve advantages and tremendous advantages. I mean, look at civilization. I mean, civilization is the output, the consequence of this innovation in evolution.
So, I mean, I've actually, when listening to Patricia Churchland, I think I made a connection that possibly, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong here, possibly consciousness, it didn't start as complex as it is right now. Just like everything else, just like the abiogenesis argument, when they start talking about irreducible complexity, well, that cell that you're talking about has actually evolved multiple times over.
Yeah, billions of years, right?
Yeah. So the start of consciousness did not need to be that complex. It could be just the realization that there is food, and if you develop some sort of precursor to consciousness, you can find food better, and you can imagine the competition trying to reach for the same food as yourself. Could that be it?
Yeah. I mean, that's part of it, of course. I break it down in just reminds me. I actually have in the chapter in The End of Christianity, I have an anthology by John Loftus. I have a chapter on design arguments in general. So there I'm going at it from design perspective. And I go through them all, just like you've done, and all the way up to consciousness. And I have like 1 or 2 paragraphs on consciousness. But one of the things I point out there is consciousness evolved out of a few strategies. One is tool use, and another is language, right? The ability to communicate and cooperate. And we see this actually grow up over time. Like you look at chimpanzees and other apes, they have like proto-societies in a way. They are already using tools. They're already working together for common causes. They already have something similar to our consciousness. It's not quite as complex, but it's a stage of it. And you can go back in time. Like monkeys have they have metacognition. So monkeys don't really have self-cognition, but they can actually intuit intentions of other minds. So they're already starting to build models of other minds. So you can look at evolution over time, over the last, million, 2, 3 million years, 4 million years, 10 million years. And you can see this gradual evolution all the way from like cats who can model their environment. All social animals can actually model some degree of this. So you see the increasing degree of consciousness correlating with an increasingly complex brain, and the resulting behaviors. And you can see it over time, and you can see it in surviving, living fossils, which are the species that are still around, that are still occupying these niches, all the way up. So you can see by the time you get like just before us, if you look at the apes, it's pretty close already to human consciousness. It's not, you can see it's not like a radical switch from worm to human. So you see this gradual evolution, which of course is evidence that it has evolved. It's not intelligently designed, right? So anyway, yeah. So what she's talking about, I mean, it oversimplifies. It's just food, but it's not just food. But it's all the things: protection, it's housing, it's warmth, it's surviving the elements, it's water. Just the idea of thinking like putting water in a gourd so you can carry it around. Like think that like that's simple. That seems so simple, but that's actually, you notice most animals don't think of that. But if you have this mind that's built, it's evolved to like tool use, creative tool use, that actually leads to a lot of these other things that we're talking about, where you get, now once you do that and you get a social system, well, now that requires consciousness to like communicate and leverage that social system for common good. That's how it all evolves, right? That's how we end up, and it's a feedback loop. So over time, I figure if you go back to Neanderthals and so on, they would be conscious, but not as fully developed as us. But it was just a matter of time, right? Before you get humans. And of course, then humans exploded across the earth and took over and drove extinct all of our competing hominids because of that. But yeah, no, that's what happened. That's where it came from.
Indeed. So when I was talking about food, I wasn't really referring to the hominids. It's quite evident that the hominids have evolved in a certain direction, because if you track them back to a certain era, you won't find arts and culture. You would find
Right.
tools geared to the base of the foundation of the pyramid of needs, which is survival and food.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That is a good point. And you see this
Yeah.
as chimpanzees, right? Chimpanzees can figure out how to use a stick. And they can emulate other chimpanzees using the stick. That's the most primitive culture in animal history. But yeah, when you get to the hominids that are creating axes, for example, and manufacturing axes, they're still not, like you say, developing art. They still don't have religious artifacts or burying the dead. This is like ritual burials. This is from one of the earliest pieces of evidence of higher consciousness, and that is definitely, Neanderthals probably did this a little bit. They went extinct, but we were coexisting at the same time. So Neanderthals and I don't remember what the one of the early homos, one of the late homos. Sorry, no offense to people. I mean homo as in humans. Were seemed to be similarly situated in terms of interest in art and religious artifacts and building homes and things like that. And then fire, that's the other thing, right? The use of fire as a technology. But then, yes, once you get to like 40,000 years ago, we've got cave art, we've got statuary, and so it looks like religion. We've already got like some sort of religion going on, and so that's when we know it's about 40 to 50,000 years ago when we see this. And this does seem to be a human Homo sapiens.
And it's really funny how all these stages are very correspondent with the size of the brain, from 400 centimeters to inches to what is the current. I think it's gone to 1500, and now it's down to 1350 because I think we lost 10%.
Yeah, there's probably a reason for that. So we know at this time when Neanderthals existed, their brains were larger than ours. But we also know that there's a statistical death rate results from this, because the brains get larger faster than the female birth canal grows. So you have a much higher maternal mortality rate for humans, and it must have been much higher for Neanderthals. So we had an advantage. Our brains were more efficient. And this is one thing we found, that efficiency is more important than size. Size matters. You need the size. You got to have the data capacity. But you can reconfigure the brain. So you have like our cortex, for instance. The reason it's all coiled up, all curled up, and is increased efficiency. You can have more neurons packed in a smaller space. And so there's been an evolutionary drive for efficiency as well as size. And the best balance, I think we had the best balance between efficiency and size, where we had enough size to have all of this high level consciousness, but enough efficiency that we weren't killing too many of our mothers. But we still kill way more of our mothers without medical inventor, without modern medicine. We still kill more of our mothers than any other animal species. There's so many other mammals, I should say mammals in particular. Mammals can give birth to tons of copies of themselves with very little complications. Whereas humans, it's very fraught. We have a high maternal death rate. And that's because of this competition for large brains, but also bipedalism, which limits the birth canal. And this is a design failure. Like, we could have grown babies in pouches or eggs, but but that's not the pathway we took, because evolution is not intelligent. It finds the way that's available and accessible to it. It's not always the best way. It's just a way that works, right? So that's why it's one example of how we know that this is not, that God was not doing this. God would come up with better solves for these problems.
So we argue that consciousness is 3.7 billion years in the making, because that's when life sort of emerged. And prior to hominids, we're talking about organisms. I think I forget the name of the organism, but it's a living, very primitive living thing under the water that doesn't have any responses other than swimming in a certain pattern in the ocean, and slows down only in the presence of food, and that's the only thing that it does.
Right.
And that's one stimulant geared towards food. But then the natural evolution of this is that one slit that opens up, the precursor of an eye, that only what detects is light, and maybe there's food around that light, and can detect as well enemies that way from that light.
Shadows,
shadows, and that maybe that gives rise to the first precursor of consciousness, and then you can build upon that. Imagine now being a little bit premeditated and even start to imagine
more complex models of the environment, right? So, like, by the time you get to mammals, mice even can build fairly elaborate virtual models of their environment. Like, they can memorize the layout of a house. They can, or a cave or a forest or something like that. And they're integrating multiple senses, hearing, smell, sight, into a single coherent model, because that is extremely useful. If they can build that model and it corresponds roughly with reality, they can navigate the model and consequently navigate the reality. And all of this before intelligence arose, right? So this mice aren't intelligent. This is evolution building better ways for them to, like, compute and analyze and move around in their environment. It's just over time, eventually, brains started modeling themselves, right? So instead of modeling the environment, we just turned the eye of the brain in on ourselves and say, let's build a model of what's going on in the brain. Because if you can take advantage of a model of the environment, just think what you can do if you can model what's going on in the brain. It's, you can leverage that and impressively. Now, that's literally the most complicated machine ever developed in the universe. So it's obviously takes a long time for evolution to hit on that, and the right pathways have to be struck for it to even randomly get there. But that's what happened, is we started building models of our own mind, and that's what our identity is. Our self-consciousness is just a virtual model that our brains build about what's going on in our brain. And like our environmental models, it can be wrong sometimes. It's limited. It's
not that accurate, by the way.
Right? Yeah. But
the
it's
Dunning-Kruger effect attests to
that. Well, it's not just that, right? So let's talk about that, because if you go, and I say this a lot, everybody who knows me has heard me point this out. You got to go to Wikipedia and go to the entry. There is an entry at Wikipedia called "List of Cognitive Biases." That's the entry. And there's just hundreds and hundreds of these. And these are all the ways that our brains naturally fail. This shows you just how crappy our brains were designed. They were not designed intelligently. They're this random kludge of just barely good enough strategies, and that's all. And Dunning-Kruger is an example of that. Is one of those side effects
Richard,
of having a badly designed brain.
You've touched on a key word, and I think this is a telling point in the history of the evolution of the mind or the consciousness, memory. Because with memory, this is the first time we're talking about organisms.
And not just memory, narrative memory, which is significantly different. Like, a cat won't have narrative memory. They won't have a memory about themselves or their lives or their history, but they will remember things. They'll be able to recall things. Patterns. They'll recall where something is, what will happen if something else happens, so they can build strategies based on these memories. And then, of course, with our consciousness, now we can build a narrative memory, and we can use that to build long-term plans, which is what really distinguishes humans from other animals, is our ability to do long-term imaginative planning, simply because we can build this narrative memory and then navigate around in it and use it as a tool, essentially, to do better.
And with the memory comes a very interesting thing: the sense of time, the sense of the past. Yesterday is different than today, and then tomorrow, and being able to imagine something that has not happened yet, and plan. That is significant.
Yeah.
Because
absolutely.
you have to build a model of yourself that doesn't exist yet.
Right.
Acting in a certain manner. That's brilliant.
That's absolutely right. Yeah. And in order to do that, you have to build a model of your present self. And then your memory will store models of your past selves. And so, that's how you get a continuous consciousness over time. And it's all just evolutionary strategies. It's all computational strategies that had advantages. And now, of course, it wasn't planned. Evolution didn't plan on this. But now that we have this equipment, we can do a lot more things than evolution intended. We can actually understand death. We can understand mortality. We can think about our purpose and meaning. What is the meaning of life? What do we want life for? What do we like about it? Why are we here? Why do we want to be here? It's not just a question of why are we here. It's a question of why do we want to be here? And that's an answerable question, because why are we here? You have this sort of historical causal explanation. It has no interest in our welfare. But if we ask, why do we want to be here? Well, now we can actually relate that to our values. Like, what do we actually like about living? What can we actually make out of living? What can we do with it? And this is not intended by evolution. This is just an accidental byproduct of being able to do all those other things that we've been talking about.
I mean, one of the things that sort of amazes me sometimes is some secular and even atheist speakers still regard consciousness as something a little bit extra special, and it might go. So like your Penrose, and he's talking about the consciousness might be fundamental, and it could be. Look, I mean, we don't know. Maybe his idea of consciousness is not. It's not supernatural. He's going to probably talk about consciousness as being a fundamental rule of physics that we have.
His model is that there's like psycho laws, like laws of psychics, laws of psychohistory, basically this kind of idea. But they still require a material substrate. They are an emergent property of complex physical systems. So he's not proposing disembodied minds. He's not proposing souls. He's not proposing some sort of world mind. It's nothing godlike. It's just once physical objects become sufficiently complex in a particular way, there's some sort of laws of the universe, laws of existence that manifest psychic phenomena. I think that's half true. I just don't think you need the special laws. I think it's just an inevitable outcome of information processing. I think it's not even logically possible to have a universe where you would have an information processor of the right type, physical type, that wouldn't experience consciousness. I don't think it's possible to separate them logically. And so we don't need the Penrose model. It's my take on it.
I think it's a bit. I mean, I remember listening to him talking to Justin Briley, and I went to my wife and I said, I told my wife, I think I've been deepacked. It's a Deepak Chopra,
Right.
But now I understand his argument a bit better now. But David Chalmers, another philosopher, Australian, he's down under boy. He's a philosopher. But he's trying to make out consciousness and the qualia, and we're going to talk about the qualia, that subjective experience, and it's a mysterious thing.
Which ties into what I just said, right? So Chalmers, for those who don't know, is famous for developing the zombie argument. So if you've ever heard about philosophers talking about zombies, they're talking about Chalmers zombies, not Day of the Dead zombies. So the Chalmers model of the philosophical zombie is the idea that if you take and by the way, for people who are interested in this, I have an article on my blog called on hosing thought experiments, and it's about thought experiments that go wrong because the philosophers who use them don't do them correctly, and I talk about Searle and the Chinese room, and I talk about Chalmers and the zombies and various others. But so anyway, Chalmers's point is that qualia is this, like you were saying, it's this the qualitative nature of experience. Like what is redness like? So it's like, it's not just that you detect a color exists, but you actually have a specific, distinct experience of redness. Cinnamon has a very distinctive, the experience of cinnamon is distinct from the experience of fish. There are different smells, right? So there's a qualitative nature of experience that and this is where we get to the gap, that we have not explained yet. We've explained a lot of it, like we know a lot of the back architecture of what's going on, but the final step is for example, how would we predict from a particular physical system that it would experience the color red? Why is it red? Why is it like red? So like that's the one step that we can't explain. And this is the frontier of cognitive science. This is really just like biogenesis is the frontier of biology, and Big Bang Theory is the frontier of cosmology, and so on. And so we have a lot of ideas of what it could be, but we don't have a full explanation that can bridge the gap.
Sorry to interrupt, Richard, but even though we know the ontology of an apple isn't actually red because that color doesn't exist.
No, thank you. No,
so you're incorrect.
Yes, no, that's absolutely important. Colors don't exist in the world. They are fictions your brain has made up to help you understand the world. It's like if you're in a flight simulator and you're in the flight simulator, instead of being a computer making up stuff, it's tied to the signals, to the instruments on an actual plane. And we can do this. You can get in a flight simulator, connect the rig to the instrumentation on a plane, and you can fly an actual plane remotely. And it can do this without video, right? So it would just simulate the sky. The sky could be completely green, and the sky's not completely green. There's going to be blue. It's going to be clouds or whatever in the real thing, but it doesn't matter. All you need to know is it clear sky? And so it chooses a color to represent that to you. And so there's different. So it's a fiction. But it's a fiction that corresponds to a real thing. And so like the color of an apple, what's actually happening is photons of a certain frequency are bouncing off of it and hitting cones in your eye that register a certain frequency of photon, and they send an electrical signal back into your brain. And then your brain says, aha, we're going to represent this with a color. And so they just randomly, we don't know. This is the thing, was like, why does it pick a certain color? Why does the color look that way? This is the one step that we can't explain. We know what's going on. It's information processing. It's physical. The brain is doing something, but it's happening at a level that we can't see yet. It's at the level even below synapses, because there's the input-output signals in a neuron are probably based on methyl groups and DNA. It's probably super complicated what's going on in a neuron. And we can't even scan to the level of synapses, which are the connections between neurons. We can't even map the synapses of a human brain, much less map the actual IO protocol that's going on in each neuron, right? So like that, this is why we can't answer this question, because we can't get at it.
But
we
Richard,
can't get inside of it.
Don't you agree that if the qualia is an objective thing that is happening on a software level, then you won't have people called colorblind, because they have an issue with their optical nerves and they cannot see colors in the way we see them.
There's a difference between colorblind and blind sight. So there's two different things. So colorblind means that you lack the cells that can see certain frequencies of light. And so that's different, right? And in fact, there's two kinds of color blindness. And if you have the genes for both, which statistically there are people who will, you will actually not be colorblind, but you'll be color inverted, which means that everything that person experiences as red, we experience as green, and vice versa. So it's qualia inversion. But there's no way to know who feels like this, because there's no way to show, like you can't show it up on a screen what's going on in your brain to someone. So they go, oh, look, you see green when I see red. You don't know, because there's no way to actually get inside someone's head to see that. And so that's one of the challenges of qualia, explaining it. But to get back to Chalmers, and I'll get to blind sight later, but to get to Chalmers, so he proposes, well, what if you have two people who have physically everything is identical? There's no differences between their brains. They're absolutely identical. It's very crucial for this thought experiment that they have to be identical. And then one of them has no qualia. They experience no qualia whatsoever. And his point is like, how could you tell them apart? And if you can't tell them apart, how can the physical brain explain qualia, right? Like qualia seems to be qualia being like the color, the redness of red, the cinnamonness of cinnamon, the feeling of love, like what things feel like and seem like. That's qualia. So he's saying like there must be something else besides the physics of the brain, and this is what that causes that, and this is what religious people latch onto. Oh, well, that's the soul that comes from God, etc. But the problem is that doesn't really work, because suppose that were the case, and you have two people with physically identical brains, and you ask them, do you experience qualia? And now you've got a conundrum. How do they answer? Now, if they answer differently, well, then they don't have physically identical brains, right? Because it would be physically impossible for them to answer differently. So if they answer the same, well, now you've got a problem, because that means one of them is lying. But if one of them is lying, we know different parts of the brain will be activated. So you'll be able to see that they are physically different. So that now they're not physically the same, which means that the only way that a philosophical zombie, according to in Chalmers's model, the only way a philosophical zombie could answer the same to that question and say, yeah, I experience qualia, and answer all questions the same way, if we probe about qualia and stuff. The only way that's possible is if they were lying, but actually believed it was true. And here's the real clincher here, is that if you're lying about seeing qualia, but you genuinely believe that you're seeing qualia, well, what's the difference between that and seeing qualia, right? That's actually what it is, right? Is like, we believe we're seeing it, therefore we do. And so it just dissolves the distinction. There is no such thing as a philosophical zombie.
But even if the other person answers, I don't have qualia, how do you know what qualia is to answer no?
Well, you and I just talked about it, right? So that would be the example of why would they answer differently? That's right. That would be the interesting question. There'd be something physically different about how they're understanding the question, or the process, whatever's processing going on in their brain, they understand it differently. Whereas you and I can talk about qualia, and we both know what we're talking about. So that's the whole point, is like, if you were a philosophical zombie, that should be impossible, unless you're consciously lying, which would also be impossible because we could detect that. It would show physically different. Or you're not lying. You actually genuinely believe you see qualia. And that's the point, is that's what seeing qualia is that you believe.
Do you think the philosophical zombie is been inserted there to make a problem out of something that isn't really a problem? Just to make it more, yeah, okay.
I think it's I think qualia is the logically necessary outcome of certain kinds of information processing. I don't think it's possible in any possible universe to have a system that runs a certain way, a computational system that computes information in a certain way, that doesn't experience qualia. It's not possible. And there's an argument. Cottrell did an article on sniffing the camembert about qualia. He makes this argument, is exactly what I just argued, is basically like, there's no possible way to actually organize any universe where you could have conscious processing, like the complex processing that our brains are doing, and not have consciousness. It's an inevitable byproduct of it in all possible universes. So you don't need God or any other explanation for why it happens. It's just, there's no way to stop it happening. It's an inevitable consequence of what our brains are doing.
I mean, a lot of people are asking what a qualia is, and I think we've sort of explained it. It's just that sense of subjective experience.
It's the aspect of what it's like to experience things that you cannot communicate to people. You can use words, like I can say that sign over there is red, but I'm counting on you being able to imagine what red looks like, right? So I can't, there's no sentence I can convey that describes red to you. If you've never seen it, if you've never experienced it, there's no proposition that I can write down that would convey what red is like to you. So that's the aspect of qualia, is it's this, you have to actually be the processor to know what it is to be like the processor, essentially. So you have to be able to process the color red in your information processing unit in order to know what red is like. Otherwise, you will never know what it's like. And you had mentioned colorblind people. Colorblind people can experience those colors. You can actually put an electrode in the brain and cause them to experience the colors. It's because the defect is only in their eyes. It's not in their brains. But there are people who have blind sight, which is where you have brain damage that has cut the circuits from one part, the visual processing part of your brain, the color processing circuit, and the rest of your brain, so that you can't integrate color experience with the rest of your experience. But the wires from that part of your brain are still connected to the linguistic circuits. So you have this weird phenomenon where people can tell you what color they're seeing, but they also report to you that they see no colors. So basically you say, like, I don't see any color. Say, well, just guess. And they guess right, which means that their brain, the part of their brain that attaches words to a color experience, is working. They're talking to each other. But the part that integrates the color experience with the rest of their experience is cut off. Those wires are severed. And so you get these odd phenomena. Like you get split brain patients is another example, where you can show a color to one half of the brain and talk to the other half of the brain, and the other half of the brain has no idea what you're talking about. And so that's the thing about how these.
But you notice, Richard, both situations are linked to physical.
Correct.
And
Yeah,
that's what
it's a
not
machine.
something suspended in the air, like an
Right.
ether. It's connecting us.
Yeah, it's a machine, and this is how we know all this is if you break it. That's how you learn so much about the fact that it's a machine, and also how it works is all the ways we break it. So all the brain damage, all the surgery that we've had to have on brains to save people's lives, removing tumors and things like that. When you take pieces out, the brain malfunctions, and it malfunctions in bizarre ways. That tells you a lot about how the brain actually works. But that shows you it's a physical machine. You tinker with it and it doesn't function correctly anymore.
Yeah, and just like anything in evolution, for all these tricks that prove to be very, very handy at some point, and they really help us, they have their side effects. So with pareidolia and hyperactive agency detection, you get the saving your bacon when you're sort of primitive, but then comes with it then that being gullible and believing in things that don't exist.
Yeah, it's the agency overdetection is what you're referring to, right? There are many of these biases, but agency overdetection is one that's very implicated in religious belief, and we have a hyper tendency to detect agency and intention in things, which is why in the early primitive religions, it rained on my parade, therefore there must be some angry person, must be a god or something, controls the rain, was mad at me for doing something else. So we have this tendency to assume that trees have intelligent spirits, that the weather is controlled by an intelligence, and we over detect agency. We see agency where it doesn't exist. And the reason is because it's cheaper, it's less costly to over detect than to under detect, right? So if you under detect, well, then some intelligent agent is going to kill you. Or get the better of you or whatever. Whereas you over detect, the cost of over detecting, it's not zero, but it's less, right? It costs you less to over detect. And so our brains evolved agency over detection, which leads us to assume that gods exist and control things. And, the Hurricane Katrina must have been because of gay people or something. It's like that is the primitive brain that evolved agency over detection.
So using the same analogy, do you think this qualia, then the subjective self
aspect,
has actually helped us immensely, because now we can have an understanding of ourselves and things around us, and we can detect other intentional agencies. Therefore, we can grab more food and avoid having our food robbed. But at the same time, it's creating this subjective truth dilemma. So in a colony of ants, they have collective minds, and you will never find two ants discussing, So we're now sitting and saying, this is my truth. This is my truth is Jesus Christ has risen. So and you get all this subjective truth dilemma.
That's right. It does cause a lot of problems. Subjective truth dilemma leads to all kinds of ideologies, mythologies, belief systems, false ego beliefs, like assuming that you're better than you are at things, all kinds of stuff like that. Yeah, it is a problem. But every particular aspect of the way our brain evolved causes all these negative side effects. Evolution doesn't care how much we fuck up. It only cares that we fuck up less than whoever we're competing with. That's it. That's its standard, right? It's all you need is to do a little bit better than the other person. And once you get to a certain level where you're almost unkillable, like human civilization, we've gotten to that point. There's not really as much incentive to actually accelerate this ability. And it has practical limits too. There's practical informational processing limits based on how big our brains can be, but even also communication. So there's even a limit to how big our brains can be, because the time it takes for a neuron on one side of the brain to talk to another, once you get past a certain threshold, there's no advantage. It's actually a disadvantage. You can't. So there's a limit on how much memory you can operate with. Even if you have a ton of memory, you can't run on it all the time, because it's too much. It takes too long to go through all your memory. That's why we have a hard time with memory. It's you can't remember veridically everything in your life. And people who can, if you're autistic and you have a particular ability to do this, it becomes impairing, actually. It actually limits you, because you're too busy focusing on all this processing you're doing, that you can't react to things. There's a famous example. There was an autistic author who talked about an example of this, where they were in college and they used to navigate from one class to another by crossing a quad, right? This open area. and they used to, they memorized the route and got there all the time. But there was one time where the class ran late, like an hour late or something, and so they went, and then they got lost, and they actually had to stop and think, like, why can't I don't recognize anything? Why can't I find the route? And they realized that the reason is that the sun had moved, and so all the shadows had changed, right? And so their brain had memorized patterns based on where the shadows were. And now the shadows have moved. They couldn't find their way, which is both an advantage and a disadvantage. It shows like they're super hyper attentive to detail, which is like impressive in its own right? There are certain things you can do with that kind of hyper attention to detail. The rest of us just blithely go through life ignoring most things, like where the shadows are, right? And so like there's an advantage to undercomputing things, and there's a disadvantage to overcomputing them. And that's an example of that. And evolution has attenuated to that, which is why we have a lot of the flaws that we do, is because there are actual physical limits to what we can do. And our brain is a physical machine. It's not this infinitely capable soul that theists want it to be.
And I can completely understand that, because if you have a very complex machine going on, and all what you have to do is a simple desktop interface for the UX and the UI for the user to sort of enjoy the ride without having to understand how the binaries behind the thing work.
Right.
But,
yeah.
Yeah. But in terms of subjective experience, I don't know if you watched this movie before, called Equilibrium by Christian Bale.
Everybody's telling me about this movie. I've not seen it. I've heard about it, but I've not seen it.
Watch it.
Yeah.
It was released around The Matrix, 1999 to 2000.
Yeah, right. That's what I heard.
And it's talking about a society where they've discovered that subjective experience is a weakness of the human being, and they've started to destroy all arts, all music, everything. Anybody who holds any of that, there's a certain police that will go and raid your home and take these things away and start burning them. Anything that it will invoke emotions had to be destroyed. Christian Bale was one of those officers, and he was absolutely gruesome. Like, he does not hesitate. And one of his missions, he went out and he had to destroy some art, and heard some noise coming out of a boot of a car, opened the boot, and it was a puppy. And the puppy, according to the law, had to be shot in the head. And he froze, and he started crying. and he changed. And then he opened the windows, had to have shutters. Then he started watching a sunset, and put an opera piece and start crying again.
Yeah. Now,
is that and I've got just goosebumps now in my body now, just remembering these scenes. This negative bit of subjective experience that we're just talked about is also the very reason why we're so colorful and interesting, aren't?
That's right. That's absolutely right. Yeah.
The balance is incredible. How do we balance this rubbish?
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because there are all of these byproducts of what evolution was doing that weren't the goal of evolution. They were just an inevitable, unavoidable consequence of what it did, that we now can take advantage of and see, like, this was super valuable. We got lucky here. We can do so much more with this than the evolutionary process was doing with it. And like you said, like all of this instrumentation, all of this ability to experience art and beauty, and experience just the enjoyment of life, the joy of life in general, the joy of love and friendship and companionship, music, everything, all of these things are byproducts, and you can show how each one evolved, like what function it served, or what function the underlying machinery served, why that exists, and then it has all this extra byproduct that we now can create and work in. We can live in this world of experience that evolution has given us, and we can do so much more with it because we are now intelligent, right? So that's where intelligent design arises. We're the intelligent designers. We are now we've become conscious. Now we can start doing things contrary to evolution's intent, because we can intelligently reason things out. We don't have to go like evolution, where we blindly, randomly try things and let natural selection sort them out. We don't have to do that. We can actually intelligently go at things. And we are, of course, the only entity in the universe, or at least locally around Earth, that can do this. As we know, we have no evidence of any other entities that can do this but us. But that doesn't mean like other animals don't have the same, that they can have beauty experience as well. They can have, because they've evolved the same pathways, doing the same things. So they have experience. They have an experiential life as well. At least certainly mammals do. And so, but we can do so much more with it because now we're self-aware. We can actually build on this, and that's how we get art and all of these other things that make life worth living. Now that we have the opportunity to do it, we can seize that opportunity. And that is a gift. It's not an intentional gift. No one planned that for us. It's just an inevitable byproduct of what happened. And now that we're the lottery winners, we can use it, and we can do great things with it.
We attribute the word illusion with being deceived. It's a negative word. It's like, that's, you're under an illusion, or, that's a horrible thing, or there's an illusionist, like a magician, that will come trying to trick you into things. So it's a negative connotation. But if consciousness is nothing but a trick of the mind to make life a bit easier for us to navigate, and now we understand it to be that way, could we be benefiting from it rather than being victims of it?
Yeah, I was just thinking about this earlier today when I was thinking about illusion theory. Sam Harris makes this argument that the self is an illusion. It isn't, actually. And I think this confuses what an illusion is, right? So if you see a mirage, right, it looks like water on the horizon, and it's actually just refracted light because of heat rising off of tarmac or stone or something like that. The only thing that's the illusion is that there's water there. Otherwise, everything about it is real. Like the appearance of water there, that's actual photons, actual light. There's an actual thing out there that's doing that. And it's the same with color. Like, nothing is red in the world. Outside of our brain, there is nothing red. There's nothing green, blue. None of those colors exist. Photons vibrating at certain frequencies do exist. Reflecting, being absorbed, and so on, or transmitted through different physical media. That is real. So even though our brain is inventing colors to represent the outside world does exist. And so the representation does correspond to a real thing. Not when we're dreaming or hallucinating, but when we're normally operating through consciousness, like an apple, you say an apple is red. That's because certain photons of a specific frequency really are bouncing off of that apple. So there is a physical truth there. It's not like our brain is just inventing the color of apples at random. It's trying to reconstruct actual physical data about the apple. It really is. And it's using red as just a representative, like a code, a stand-in. The same way we use words. Like, there's no cosmic reason an apple has to be called apple in English. We just made that up. Apple is a made-up word. But that doesn't mean apples don't exist, right? We made up the code word to refer to apples. Our brain has done the same thing. It made up colors to refer to actual photon vibration frequencies. So it's not really that. It's an illusion only in the subjective aspect of it. But what it's attempting to communicate to you, what the tool use of it is real. It is trying to recreate something that's real, represent something that's real in the world. And so the identity, like when you're talking about Sam Harris and in itself, the self is real. Like, your brain is physically separate from other brains. Only you have access to what's in your brain, and other than through speaking, by which you can communicate to other people. And you have to make decisions. Like, all that information is in your brain. You have to make decisions. It's one person, one brain. And you have your own narrative history. You have your own narrative future. So there is, the self is a real thing. And the self experience, like self-awareness, is a construct. It is a model. So there is an illusory aspect to it. It is an invention of the brain, but it's not a random invention of the brain. It's an attempt to model something that's real, which is everything, all the processing that's going on.
So, Richard, I'm going to go all Jordan Peterson on you now. And it depends what you mean by self.
True. Absolutely. And I love that, because that is a really philosophically important kind of question. Is, let's be specific what we're talking about, right? It's like, how do you define that? That really, as it's not a bogus question. A lot of people think, like, when you pull that people, you're trying to pull something. It's like, no, that's actually an important question. We do need to mean, like, what do you mean by the self? What do I mean by me? And because a lot of valuable philosophy comes out of answering that question. There is an answer, obviously, and we can go into that. But yeah, it's an important answer important question to ask, is what do you mean? And then you want to make sure that you're not doing equivocation fallacies, where you mean self in one sense over here, and then suddenly you've switched to self in another sense over here. and then you've reached a conclusion where you assume they're the same thing. That's a
So
common mistake.
I think Sam Harris is sometimes is a victim of mixing too many Oriental and Western philosophies. And I
Well,
think
yeah, that's also true.
it's just that because the self in Buddhistic sort of disciplines is it's an illusion, and he's trying to go back to the source and all that.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. His philosophy is highly infected by Buddhist dogma in a way that I think blinds him to better philosophical solutions to certain things. But and that's true in a lot of aspects of his philosophy. But it's worth pointing that out.
It's amazing because he can be very clinical in other areas, like absolutely black and white. And then he goes to that area and suddenly everything is marred and a little bit sort of blurred, as if it's a weakness of him. It makes him feel good. To be, which is, we all victims of that, and you try, all what you're trying to do in your life is become aware of that so you can combat it, because we're, comfort zone is a wonderful thing.
Well, to draw this back to the God of the Gaps argument. So like we've covered a lot of aspects of this. And in my book, Sense and Goodness Without God, where I go into this, I have 6 arguments as to how we know the mind is a physical product of a machine. And it's important to make the distinction that the mind is a product. It is a process. Experience, consciousness are an outcome. They are not the object itself. So the brain is not consciousness. Consciousness is what the brain does. Right. So the brain has to be working. It's like running. Running is not legs. It is a thing that legs do. Consciousness is a thing that a brain does. It is not the brain itself. But all of the information is stored in the brain in some fashion, out of which you construct your consciousness. So, but you look at all these lines of evidence of mind-brain physicalism. We have tons of different angles of it. We've, like I mentioned, subtractive. So you could like pull parts of the brain out from injury or surgery, and then we've shown every single thing the brain does, every single thing the mind does has a brain part that you can remove and that will stop that part of the consciousness, right? Vision, sound, names, faces of people. Like there's a part of the brain that if you cut it out, you actually cannot recognize faces anymore. You see the faces, you see the whole structure of the face, but you can't recognize it. You can't put a name to the face anymore. And it's just weird things like that. We have a ton of that. It shows how physical the brain is, what a machine it is. And then we have positive correlation, where you can put electrodes in and cause stimulation of certain specific parts of the brain will cause certain experiences to occur. We have comparative anatomy. We have the size, which parts of the anatomy of the brain itself. The brain has its own internal anatomy. And so it's not just size as you go down to other animals. There's also parts. So like the octopus, for instance, has a large brain for its body size, but almost all of its brain is tied into controlling the color of its skin. It's a chameleon. So it is devoted a huge component of its processor to just changing the color of its skin to hide itself. Which, so you could look at comparative anatomy, and you can see like what do the parts do across animal kingdom and what is the behavioral outcome of them. And there's many other lines of reasoning. They all converge on the same conclusion, is that consciousness is entirely the product of a physical machine that is the brain. The machine is not superbly designed. It's a kludge. A kludge is like the word for a randomly cobbled together thing with duct tape and spring and strings and whatever to make it work. It is a kind of cobbled together thing over time. It's not intelligently designed. It fails in a lot of ways. We've been able to improve on it hugely with culture. So science, logic, mathematics, these are all tools we invented to bypass the failure rate of the brain. Where we use these tools, we can do better than the brain natively does. So we've outdone evolution basically through memetics, through cultural evolution, technologies, ideas, and inventions. But all of this stuff, you put it all together, including the thing I mentioned before, that our brains kill our moms at a surprisingly alarmingly high rate compared to other animals, because we need this large brain, but we also need to walk upright because of the way we evolve. It's sort of random it's another kludge. The human body is a kludge. It's just sort of like cobbled together at the last minute, basically, of whatever you can do. All of this shows that the mind is completely dependent on the brain. The brain is completely a product of blind evolution. It's not an intelligent design thing. There is nothing else to explain. So there's nothing for God to explain. even though there is a gap here, which is that we haven't fully explained why our personal experience is the way it is. We can explain a lot of things, like we can explain why we see the colors we do, but we can't explain why they look the way they do. Why does red look red? Why does green look green? So that's the stage that we haven't explained yet. But we know, and I know you've mentioned this before, that if you look at all the other things we couldn't explain, there have been millions of things that we couldn't explain, that we now have explained them. Every single time we found it's a physics explanation. Physics explains it. So the odds are, if you're going to bet on this horse, you're going to bet on physics. Physics is going to explain it. Like the odds that it's going to be this one time out of millions of times, it's going to be ghosts. That's a bad bet. You're a terrible gambler. If that's where you're putting, that's the horse you're putting your money on. You're probably going to lose.
Yeah, I mean, people were trying to locate the idea of the essence of a man. You know, he's starting with them. Oh, it started way before McDougall, but it was a doctor in Boston, the 21 grams guy, made a movie out of it.
That's
so
right.
he was weighing bodies and they realized it was they were losing 21 grams, but people then told them it might have been flatulence.
Right. Yeah. Well, gas and water, right? So, right.
Yeah, and so people were trying to sort of quantify this sort of missing bit, because let's face it, when somebody dies, something looks missing. They're no longer animated. They're no longer themselves.
Yeah.
Something has happened. But is looking for the consciousness in one area in the brain, even in terms of the realms of science, is the wrong way to go about it, because it might be the emerging property of complexity that give rise to this notion that's called consciousness, and is not going to be located in one area of the brain.
Yeah, it's like if you're playing chess on your computer and you could micronize yourself really small and go into the microchip, and someone said, go find the pawn. You couldn't do it because there isn't one location on the microchip that is the pawn. I mean, the word pawn incorporates rules, position, all of these things that they're scattered across many registers in the microcircuit. So there isn't a location, there isn't a pawn in the computer. It's like the Zoolander thing where they said it's the information is in the computer, and they try tearing the computer physically apart. It's in the computer. I don't see it. That's not how it works. No, the human consciousness is an emergent product of an entire processor. The same as like if you're playing Grand Theft Auto or something, right? There's a whole complex world going on there. There's people. There's almost a three-dimensional, like a representation of a three-dimensional world. There's cars. There's objects, signs that say things. There's all of this stuff. It's a really rich, complicated thing going on. But there's no one location in the chip where all of that stuff is. It's the whole chip and the whole array of all the memory registers, the whole RAM. All of it is cooperating to make that happen. So you couldn't go in and find a one location. It's the same with human brains. It's not that every part of your brain is being used at every time to construct consciousness, but it's a global phenomenon of the brain. Like it's a product of a huge array of interacting parts of the brain. And such that you take them out and you're take out a piece of the consciousness. And eventually, if you keep taking parts out, the consciousness breaks down altogether, right? And then you're dead, basically, you're brain dead at the very least. So no, there isn't one location. It's not the pineal gland like Descartes hypothesized. There's no one location where consciousness arises. It's a cooperation of all the parts of the brain.
I want to end, and I've actually posed this question to my other two speakers in cosmology and abiogenesis, and the gaps.
Nice.
They sort of preceded the consciousness, the emergence of consciousness, is the possibility of a simulation. Because every time I look at a simulation hypothesis, I think it can actually answer a lot of things.
Did you brought this up with Krauss and
yes, I did. Yeah. I did. And he laughed. He said, "Look, it's a unfalsifiable hypothesis, so it just can't. It's lovely. You can make sort of nice movies about them, but if you live in one, you will not be able to tell the difference."
Well, the movies teach you a lot, actually, about the philosophy of this. So I do actually discuss this on my blog. I have a blog article called 8 Questions So someone wrote an article claiming there were 8 questions we'll never answer. And I said, no, we've already answered them all, actually. And one of them was this, well, is it a simulation or not? We'll never know. And it's like, well, I mean, it's possible we'll never know, but the odds are extremely low, because if you look at what's required for a simulation hypothesis, is you have to propose this massively elaborate architecture of things for which you have no evidence, whereas you could just have what you have, right? So it violates Occam's razor, right? It requires a massively improbable collection of coincidences of things that have to exist, because it's not just that we're saying it's a simulation. We're adding the additional hypothesis that it is a simulation specifically engineered to prevent us ever discovering that it's a simulation. And to tie this into a specific example, Nick Bostrom. I'm sure you've read Bostrom as a classic proponent of this. And so he built a trilemma argument for the simulation hypothesis. And there is one flaw in the argument. I mean, it's logically valid. His trilemma construction is valid. But the one premise that goes wrong is that in reality, if we get to the point in this universe, or let's say a past universe, doesn't matter, where we can literally co-opt all the matter in the universe to just create simulations, right? Let's say that's how for billions, trillions of years in the future, where we've completely turned all matter in the universe into a giant computer, maximize the use of resources for this. What is that computer going to be doing? It's going to be games and paradises, right? It's all games and paradises. That's what we're going to use it for. We're not going to use it for horrible, boring, and massively immoral ancestor simulations. That was because his theory requires that we're going to turn it all into endless repetitions of the Holocaust for some reason. I can't even imagine why even the most sociopathic of aliens would waste their computer on that, right? Like maybe they'll have one Holocaust sim to laugh at.
This was actually proposed, Richard. Yeah, this was proposed and actually said that this particular advance, it looks like we are improving in terms of ethics as we progress. So hypothetically, that advanced civilization would have reached better improvement of ethics that will actually does not allow them to do that. But
right.
the other,
you would think. I mean, odds are, which is important to Bostrom's argument, right? So this is crucial because you could say statistically, maybe 1 out of 1,000 civilizations becomes like massively sociopathically evil. But that doesn't get the result that Bostrom needs, right? You need actually like 999 out of 1,000 civilizations become unconscionably evil. Odds are they're not. They're either going to kill themselves off, or they're going to natural selection. They're going to end up.
But there's a way around it. It was actually proposed as well because Nick Bostrom is actually it's syllogism and gives the simulation 33.33%, 1/3 of.
I know it's too high. It's
way too high, in my opinion, too. But he reckons, what about if this culture is completely divorced from its original past? And the simulation, they've actually harnessed the power of consciousness, and it's a consciousness-driven simulation that all what it does is trying to understand its humble beginnings by rewinding the tape.
But it wouldn't do it so unethically. That's the thing. And also, it's such a waste of resources. Like games and paradises. Whoever's going to be controlling this is like, why should I waste time on reconstructing a horrible past when I could just make a beautiful future? You know what I mean? Like,
but that's exactly, Richard. You'd ask the same question about right now. Why do we make sad movies? Why do we make sad songs? It's that.
Well, we make sad movies, but we know they're actors. Silence of the Lambs. No one's actually getting killed in Silence of the Lambs.
But in simulation,
we would not be making those movies.
Yeah. In a simulation, it will be quite the same. But the one thing I love about this is there's something called the just-in-time simulation, because they said one of the physical impossibilities about this hypothesis is so much data to render, and they call it the just-in-time rendering of the information. So when you're digging a hole, it's being rendered as you dig it. But the one thing that really I loved is about the speed of light and why it's cosmic, why it's 300,000 kilometers per second. Because if you crack that, you get to reach your simulators. So that's the law that's been put to stop you from falling out.
The speed of light is actually 1. When you put it in natural units. Natural units is Planck length to Planck time. Yeah. So the speed of light is 1 Planck length in 1 Planck time. So it's actually 1. In other words, it falls out as it's not even a constant. It disappears from all equations once you put natural units in. So it's clearly a function of the quantum mechanical minimum time space size. So once you get below a certain time and below a certain size, time and distance no longer mean anything. Like they
or
so,
time.
so it's because of quantum mechanics that you end up
if
with.
you are the photon itself, you will not experience the time. You won't
Oh well, that also is true. Yeah,
yeah.
All time is it's zero, right? Zero
Yes.
passage of time. So no, but you were hinting at something else that people don't realize, which is there's a book called Labyrinths of Reason that has a chapter on this. So out of computational theory, like computer theory, you can show that it actually any simulation of a system requires more resources than the system itself. Because you have to have the architecture of the computer doing the simulation and then all the complexity of the simulation. So the lesson is the most efficient computer to simulate something is the thing itself. So the most efficient way to simulate you is to just make you and have you walk around and follow you around and film what you do. That would be the most efficient way to film, to simulate Hanney Seylim, right? So, and when you look at in terms of the Bostrom argument, you couldn't have a million sims of this universe in this universe. In fact, you couldn't even have one simulation of this universe in this universe. You would have to artificially shrink the universe. So it wouldn't even be a simulation of this universe. It would be an artificially smaller universe. So there's actually a computational physics reason why the Bostrom argument doesn't work. But there's a way he could get around this. What it does is it reduces the motivation to even have ancestor sims, because you can never have a simulation of the universe you're in. You can only have a simulation of a much more simplified universe, what's the value of that? That's no longer the universe you want to study. It's an artificial universe that you subtracted a lot of stuff from. So the motivation to have ancestor sims is kind of eliminated by computational physics.
Yeah, but in a way, it's been proposed that it can actually answer the question of consciousness.
Yeah, there's a lot of holographic theory. If people go look up holographic theory, this is a serious theory in physics. It does not require simulation theory. It would work by itself. It's just that holographic theory looks a lot like what the result would be if you were simulating a universe.
Yeah, well, it goes back to
there's a lot of fancy things you can do.
It goes back to Plato, right? I mean, Plato, the forms, things are projected. They're not really what they are.
Right. Yeah. Plato's cave, right? Plato's cave would be a person who gets out. That's just like the Matrix. We referenced that earlier. If you get out and you come back and try to explain to people that, no, there's this giant computer that's actually simulating us, and they don't believe you, right? That's Plato's cave, but modernized to a computational context. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, it seems to be like an ongoing. It's an interesting conversation, and I think it's going to produce a lot of arts, a lot of movies.
A lot of fascinating things with movies and the way you explore possibilities and stuff. I find it very valuable. Fiction is incredibly valuable as a philosophical tool. So I don't poo-poo it at all.
No, not at all. I mean, it's the human. We're reflecting on our conditions, and some do it better than others. Some movies are worth looking at. Absolutely. So I think we've reached it.
That suggests. I know you're about to wrap up, but that suggests another entry in this series you're doing, because I think the next one you're going to do is moral theory, or you're going to try and make
sources of morality.
The other is beauty, right? After morality, then you get to beauty. Because there's this argument, the Plantingian argument, like, well, nothing explains beauty except God. That's another God of the gaps argument. So it would be interesting if you could find someone who's an expert in the science of aesthetics.
But beauty is the most debatable. That's the most. That's so subjective. It's in the eye of the beholder.
There are some objective aspects to it, but yeah, it is mostly subjective. I have a whole section on my book in this about there is a science of aesthetics, and it is a neuroscience, actually, and it's not leading to God; it's leading to evolutionary explanations. But so anyway, I'll let you go. I know you want to.
No. I'm really enjoying the conversation, but I think we've covered everything to do with consciousness today. Do you have any last sort of thoughts that we can put together to sort of to put this area once and all to bed, because it seems to be these folks were saying, okay, well, you don't know the answer to this, and therefore, and why this is so dangerous. That stands.
Yeah, the immediate response to that is that whenever there is something we haven't explained yet, we need to look at the past of all the other things we've not explained, but then did explain, and ask yourself, what has it turned out to be? And so then you base your odds on that. Like, and it's never turned out to be gods, spirits, angels, demons. It's never shown up. It's always turned out to be physics. So you should bet on the winning horse, the horse that's won a million times before. It's going to be this one. And we already have a lot of the convergent evidence that that's the case, as we've discussed in this show today, that all the convergent evidence is pointing in the direction of physics. It's not pointing in the direction of God or anything supernatural.
I'd like to thank you very much, Richard. I always enjoy the conversation. It's slightly different than other speakers because somehow you're a wonderful communicator. Your ability to bring complex ideas but put them down to earth.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, I've cultivated a career trying to figure that out. Right? Is how do I bring these ideas down to earth so people understand them? And it does take listening to people, right? Listening to my opponents, right? Like seeing like how they're seeing things. Then I can figure out, oh, I see what you need to see to fill in this gap here, to figure out what I'm talking about and so on. And I would encourage other people to do that. Like actually try to understand the perspective of people who disagree with you. That'll help you become a better communicator of why you think they're wrong. And yeah, that's the way to proceed with education and so on. Plus, I'm colloquial. I'm not stuffy, so.
Oh, that's what that's.
I will use swear words and colloquialisms freely.
We haven't talked about this bit, but you know that that outsider area of the brain that sort of give rise to empathy and sympathy. These are the things that will actually make you put yourself in other people's shoes. But that's newish. That's only about 2 million years old. It's not.
Yeah, and it's part of. We need this to leverage social cooperation for advantage, collective advantage. We all benefit from cooperating together. You need that. You need what's called metacognition, which is the ability to simulate what someone else is thinking and understand things from their perspective. And to do that, you have to have your own perspective to compare it with. So that's how we evolved consciousness.
Thank you. To the viewers, Richard's full details are in the description of the video. Website, how to get in touch with Richard. Richard, do you want to finish with the online courses you provide and just a glimpse of what you're working on at the moment?
Yeah, so my website, richardcarrier.info, you can get all the things there. One of the links at the top is taking courses. I do multiple courses. They're simple 1-month quick courses. Very affordable. It gets you a chance to like pick my brain for a whole month on whatever the subject is. I do many subjects in philosophy and history, so go check that out. You can see what interests you or whatever, and get involved in that. It's valuable and useful. You'll find utility in all of those quick 1-month courses. Other than that, I have my books and I have my blog. And that's if you're interested in supporting my work or checking out what I've done in both philosophy and history, I've got a lot of that. Some stuff in politics and economics and other stuff, but it's mostly from a philosophy angle. So no, that's the place to go. Just check out just go clicking around in richardcarrier.info and you'll find all the interesting stuff that I'm creating and that I do for a living. So this is actually my career. I do this in one way or another, whether it's writing the blog or teaching courses or going on shows to communicate what I've learned and what I want other people to know.
Brilliant stuff. Thanks very much, Richard. Okay, folks, we'll wrap this up pretty soon, but next episode is going to be next week with Dan Barker, and we're going to do step number 4 in the God of the Gap series, covering the areas of where do moral intuitions come from.
Right. Yeah,
it's
nice.
Always a dicey topic. But thank you so much for accepting our invitation, Richard, and I really hope you have a great day.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad to be here. Always have a good time on your show.
Thanks very much. All right, people, we'll see you next week.